Hello, my name is Matthew Graff. I'm Collections Manager here at the Dearborn Historical Museum, and today I'd like to provide a showcase of one of the largest collections of artifacts we have at this museum. And that collection belongs to the McFadden-Ross family, whom the house we're currently filming in is named after. The McFadden-Ross family owned a great deal of artifacts. They weren't in the upper echelon of society. They were more a middle-class farming family. And for their background, Nathaniel Ross, patriarch of the family, was born in Ireland in 1825 and immigrated to America in the 1850s along with his brothers. While working on the Michael McFadden farm, he met Elizabeth Wilson and they were eventually married. They soon mortgaged the farm to buy the Powder magazine, which is the building we're standing in now, in 1883, and they remodeled it into a farmhouse, a livable farmhouse, because its prior purpose was to serve as part of the Detroit Arsenal here in Dearbornville, where it was essentially just a depository for gunpowder, and this large door over to the side of me is an original door that would have been on the outside of the Powder magazine before it was converted into a farm home by the Ross family. Nathaniel farmed the 4 acres of land around this property, and when he passed away, Lizzie, along with eventually her brother Lytle, would continue to live in this house. Now Lizzie, when she lived here, she wasn't always the older, grandmotherly-like figure that we have portrayed prominently on our meeting room wall. This is a picture of Lizzie Ross when she was just a young girl. And as she grew older, Lizzie never married, but she did have a few passions in life. She had a passion for animals, as you can see here, with her dogs. One of the dogs by the name of Jack, who's coincidentally also the name of our chief curator here at this museum. We also have a picture of Lizzie with a horse on either side. So she was quite apt at taking care of the animals and the farmstead, but eventually the farm was sold off, and Lizzie would live the rest of her life in this house, again, without ever marrying or having children. She was very private in her older years, but she did, in her will, mention the city of Dearborn as the intended recipient of this entire swath of land to use her home as a museum building. And that's essentially the only reason why we're here, and the only reason why this event is being filmed here today. And the McFadden-Ross family was perhaps, they garnered a reputation for being very reclusive, and maybe you could say a bit reserved in their older years, but they did have a passion for, as I said, history, and also their faith was incredibly important to them. And when Lizzie passed away, all of these artifacts were then left to the museum staff who were hired to curate the collection, go through what was salvageable and what wasn't. And over the years, much of it has been cataloged, but the incredible thing is, even after the museum opened in 1956, there are literally hundreds of Ross artifacts that we are continuing to catalog to this day, because there's such an incredible amount of them in our collection. Some of them are in very poor condition and so would then have to be deaccessioned. Others are in fairly standard to good condition, and some of the best artifacts are showcased around me in this room, which was recently redone by our exhibits curator, Tyler Mall. This entire space was originally just a storage closet for exhibit material until it was redone. And what's perhaps special about the Ross collection we have is not that it is special in terms of belonging to some wealthy or famous family. Rather, it's special because it represents a typical farming family in Dearborn in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. The Ross collection offers a glimpse into the everyday life of the family who lived here. And I will begin by showcasing some of the artifacts we have here representing the Ross family. First is this incomplete and damaged violin that will soon be in the process of being restored. Several artifacts we have in our collection, Ross and otherwise, are currently undergoing restoration. This piece here would have been from the mid to late 1800s, a sort of common variant. And we also have other everyday household items, such as this shoe scraper that would have been used exactly as the name implies, to get the mud and crust and grime off your shoe before you entered the home. We also have an everyday iron, this one a Westinghouse, that was originally patented in 1908, and the patent was renewed several times, including 1916. And this is one of several Ross irons we have in our collection. Believe it or not, it's actually the better one. The other one that could have been used in this event is incredibly rusty and in poor condition and will probably eventually be deaccessioned. And we also have some relics from when the Rosses did have a farm here, including this cowbell. And every year we have a Pioneer School program. Of course, in recent months it's been postponed until after the current crisis is over, but we have this is being used currently in our Pioneer Schoolroom, which is a one-room schoolroom downstairs that we showcase to kids who come on a field trip to the museum. We also have a homemade scoop. The Rosses would have used a tree that was on their property to make this. This is one of several we have in our collection. Very rustic, very basic. It would have obviously taken time to carve this out though. And it just shows sort of their humble origins. Again, not a wealthy or prominent family, just a family going through life in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We also have a bread box here, a bit dented on the top, rusted on the inside, but otherwise in fair condition. We also have several toys, including some Cracker Jack prizes and other miscellaneous pieces, including this pop gun here. And on the lower portion we have a designation that previous generations of staff. It has a Ross designation as an accession number, which is R-T-11. In this case, the R obviously stands for the Ross family, and the T stands for the subdivision of the collection it belongs to. So in this case, this is a toy, so T for the toy collection. Other collections include B for bedding. We also have KU for kitchen utensils, F for farming equipment, so on and so forth. We also have this, which could have been used for making some popcorn. Hasn't been used in, again, generations, but I'd imagine it could still serve its function if used today. We also have several lanterns belonging to the Ross family in our collection. This is one of the ones in better condition. They would have had around the barns, which would have been, when they were here, the barns would have been where our museum office building is, which is right across the small little parking lot dividing the McFadden-Ross house and the office building. We also have this, and I mentioned Michael McFadden as being one of the ancestral family members. This allegedly, at least in our description that we have in our records, was used by him. He went on a trip to Ireland. Again, that's where the family was from. He was on a trip back to Ireland and he broke his leg. And he made this while he was there, obviously to get around. So just a common everyday piece that was used. He didn't obviously plan on breaking his leg, but it happened and he adapted. And again, to emphasize the fact that the Ross family, in their later years, they gained, again, a reputation of being sort of reclusive, but we have an artifact here that shows that even Lizzie was once a baby, and so this high chair, the Ross family had 6 children, and only 3 of them survived to adulthood, Lizzie being one of them, her brother Lytle being another. And the high chair would have been used around the house. There's also another chair in this room that would have been used by the children when they were here. It's currently in front of our display table. And the McFadden-Ross family also had a passion, as I said, for their faith. We have a book of hymns over there, and Lizzie also taught religious classes here, and we have in the McFadden-Ross parlor in this building is the only room in this house that's preserved to be approximately how it was when the Rosses were here. The rest of it, as you can see by the space around me, has been converted into exhibit gallery space. And some of their paintings and other artwork that they collected were there. And I would now like to turn to some of the artifacts we have on display around the walls of this room. And we will start with a cabinet that was restored about 2.5 years ago by one of the museum volunteers. It was previously, I should say, stored in a non-climate controlled storage where it had deteriorated over the years, but thankfully it was rescued from there and now stands along with the rest of the artifacts here on display. So we'll start with that. So some of the artifacts we have on display around this room include, as I mentioned earlier, this Spirit of Missions, the Protestant Episcopal Church, which would have belonged to the Ross family. This particular volume is from May 1887. It includes some hymns, but it also includes other discussions of the Protestant Episcopal Church, what they did for that given year, 1887, the sort of fundraising and activities and outreach that they did, some of the domestic mission work as well as the work abroad. And we also have on display here some of the more colorful Ross artifacts, including this 1-pint creosote dip, this handmade globe tobacco, and a lot of these artifacts they have that are, or I should say were name brand at the time, were purchased from Detroit, because it should be noted that Detroit was not too far from Dearbornville, and that would have been the go-to place to go to get the supplies that they couldn't obviously grow or raise on the farm. This piece, this small little piece as well, this little caterpillar, would have come from a Cracker Jack prize box. We've also got a pocket watch, one of several in the museum's collection. This ashtray, along with a couple pipes, and lots of glassware. Now we have limited space to obviously display all this glassware, but some of the more interesting pieces include these. Again, some might call them gaudy, but they sort of reflect the Ross family's taste. We've also got, down in the bottom shelf here, this belonged to Lizzie Ross, And we actually do not have, out of all the Ross categories, including, as I said, toys, kitchen utensils, farming equipment, tools, we have an abundance of some of those categories, but we actually don't have a lot of clothes that belong to the Ross family that are remaining in our collection. What we do have are a lot of clothes belonging to other Dearborn families, including literally hundreds and hundreds of women's hats in our collection. This is one of the only pieces that we do have that belonged to the Ross family and is still in decent condition. Next to this display cabinet, we have a stereoscope, which, again, is for any visitor to use. We've got currently a stereoscope of the moon, but these stereoscopes would have come out most of the ones that we have here are from the early 1900s, and it was a way for folks to get a glimpse of the outside world, or in this case, outer space, without actually having the tools or the travel money to go to these places or to get a fancy telescope and look. You could simply use this much like later technology like the viewfinder, or now we have, obviously with the wonders of the internet, you can find pretty much anything you want. But for the Ross family and for many in that early period, the stereoscopic images were the best you could do. We also have this fun piece, which is on a chair that also belonged to the Ross family. But this cat was made in 1892 as a gift for one of the Ross family members. And it's got even, the detail is fairly basic, but they did go so far as even to put the little paws on the bottom. And again, there's the old Ross designation, as well as, it's not really legible, but it does say July 5th, 1892, and October 92, again, 1892. On the shelf here, we have some more religious material. And the Ross family actually had hundreds of these in our collection. Or we actually found hundreds of these in our collection. And over the years, again, some of them have been cataloged, others have not. And we have, thankfully here, if we just had our handful of staff that normally go through the collection, such as myself, it would never get done. But thankfully we have several dedicated volunteers who come in every single week. Again, with the current limitations, not as much, but the basic goal is to go through the collection meticulously and to decide, is this piece in good enough condition, and do we have any other pieces that are like it? For instance, if we have 200 dishes that are plain white dishes, there's nothing special about them, and 10 or 12 of them are cracked or discolored or they're in really poor condition, we will deaccession them. And sometimes, with the iron that I showcased earlier, the patent dates and the research material almost reveals itself on the artifact. It's literally right there on the artifact. But a lot of times also there's a lot of research that needs to be done in terms of what time period could this be from, who manufactured it, what the price would have been, or how affordable would it have been for the Ross family back then. And this is also the sort of research that a lot of the volunteers do, in addition to the work of photographing and cataloging and inputting the data into our computer database. Over here, we have a vintage poster from the grand opening of the museum. And as you can see, Saturday, October 27th, the McFadden-Ross house officially opened as part of the Dearborn Historical Museum. At that time, the museum had been open since 1950, with its main building being the Commandant's Quarters, which is on Michigan and Monroe. But in 1956, when the McFadden-Ross house opened, this building, over the years and the decades since, has gradually become the nexus, the focal point of this entire museum. And the main reason simply is because it houses our main meeting space and also main lecture space. So all of the guild member groups that we have here, including groups like the Quilting Society, Sons of Union Veterans, the Rug Hookers, Herb Society, Garden Club, all of these various groups, again, pre-pandemic, met here on a fairly recent basis. And this building has become, as I said, the main hub of museum activity. And you can see the city's remodeling plans when they did remodel it, originally in the main meeting room space, the Rosses did not have a giant meeting room in the middle of their house. It was actually two separate areas, and the main staircase going upstairs was actually in the middle of what is now the meeting room. So the McFadden-Ross family, again, modified it from its original function as a powder magazine, and per Lizzie's will, the city modified it further. And this room, again, the floor was completely redone, paint completely redone, the lighting here completely redone just in the last year or so. So the building is continuing to evolve. A lot of the conception of history is that it's stagnant or that it's all in the past, but history can be as recent as something that happened yesterday, something that happened an hour ago. So this building's evolving history continues the story of the McFadden-Ross family. And before we go, I want to showcase two more things. One are some of the artifacts from when this was a powder magazine, which is the early history of the museum. And I would like to also end on one of our volunteers' favorite Ross pieces. Behind me, as I alluded to earlier, are some of the relics of when it was a powder magazine. Now, the only original piece, I should say, are two pieces here. This roof slate, which was part of the original roofing on the Arsenal buildings, and this lock, which would have been used in the powder magazine. Some of these other items, like this powder magazine brick from 1839, as you can see inscribed on it, we have hundreds of bricks that belong to the former Arsenal buildings in our collection. And many of them were preserved at the Commandant's quarters, but there were also several preserved on the Ross property as well. And on the lower cases, we've got some powder flasks and powder horns, which would have been a way to store gunpowder, because again, that's what a powder magazine was, along with some air vent grates at the bottom. A couple of the original air vents are actually on the outside of this building, and that you could see if you walked around the McFadden-Ross building even to this day. And this barrel here, which would have been an approximation of what an average barrel of gunpowder would have been, along with some gunpowder, that again would have been stored here when this was a powder magazine. And the Ross family lived approximately, again here at this location on Brady Street. The powder magazine was far removed from the rest of the arsenal, primarily because it did house gunpowder. If there was an accidental explosion or something to that effect, it needed to be isolated enough to not do any damage. And the McFadden-Ross family took that initial powder magazine, which was just basically a rectangular building with two giant doors on the outside, and they extended outward going north. They extended northward. They also extended upward by adding a second floor, and also a Michigan cellar, a cellar downstairs where they would store their food and other supplies. And the Ross family's history, as I mentioned earlier, continues to this day, and we keep on finding Ross artifacts that aren't necessarily cataloged as such, because only so many were cataloged at a time, including this piece here. Now, the reason we know it's part of the Ross collection is because this piece that I'm holding was cataloged with a Ross number. It had a Ross identification number on it, and it's part of the sort of red and clear glass pattern that the Rosses had an abundance of. We used to have a dining room display that had literally dozens of this type on display. And in a related area, we found this, and just by the style alone, we were pretty sure that it was a Ross piece. But the fact that it literally says Lizzie on it as a, and then on the other side it says World's Fair 1893. And the reason I'm ending the presentation on this is because one of the volunteers who did pour so much hours into cataloging and researching the Ross collection, this is one of his favorite pieces, and the reason being is because it did not have that original Ross designation, but yet it was still uncovered, added to the collection, and it's actually one of the better Ross items that we have. So in that way, the Ross family's legacy continues even to this day, because we are continually finding new stuff, and I use new in a broad sense here, but we're continually finding new items that the Ross family left behind. And sadly, the flip side of that also is that we're able to go in our original records and we can see hundreds of artifacts, because as we go through them, we highlight the ones that we found. And hundreds of items have yet to be highlighted, which means one of two things. The remainder of the items are like this Lizzie piece, in which they're in our collection, just waiting to be identified as a Ross item. And thankfully, we do have our chief curator, Jack, who has been volunteering here at this museum and now working here for decades. So he's able to identify some of the Ross artifacts. And the unfortunate truth is, for many of them, over the years, they were either lost, or in the case of some of the larger farming implements, when the barns were destroyed, they're just gone, completely destroyed, or otherwise not cataloged. So we'll never be able to achieve 100% completion in terms of reconciling the old records with what we have in our collection. But part of the challenge is going through and identifying. Some cases it's obvious, as in this 1893 Chicago World's Fair souvenir that Lizzie picked up. But in other cases it's not so obvious. And it's thanks to a dedicated group of volunteers and staff who go through them every week that the Ross family's collection continues to grow and continues to thrive here at the Dearborn Historical Museum.